It was one of Australia's greatest migrations, 16,500 Chinese migrants sailing all the way from China to here at Robe in South Australia. And then they marched on to the goldfields of Victoria. All featuring in this special episode, Chinese Milestones 200 Years in Australia. Hello, welcome. I'm Greg Granger.
Ahead, following the gold miners' trail from South Australia to Ballarat and Bendigo. Gold fever, what lured them from half a world away? And trams to paddle wheelers, retracing those historic journeys.
Imagine how it was for those early Chinese settlers. Now, they've been on a square rigger, a long, arduous journey all the way from Guangzhou in southern China. They've reached the Victorian coastline, but they're not going to land because there's a £10 landing tax, and that's more than they've paid for their trip all the way from China. They're going to sail on to South Australia. In all, there were 35 ships arrived here from 1857, arriving at the beautiful port of Robe in South Australia.
Robe was certainly a tricky place to arrive for those 16,500 Chinese gold miners. Just getting ashore could be a real struggle. In 1857, one ship, the Phaeton, sank with 260 Chinese migrants on board. They struggled ashore. Some came close to drowning, but miraculously all survived. What followed was a long walk east to the goldfields of Ballarat and Bendigo, a walk reenacted by this group, led by descendant Charles Zhang.
Charles, a very significant spot.
Yes, it is very special to us. This is a place 160 plus years ago, Chinese landed in here, walking to Victoria Goldfields.
A very historic march and a very historic place, and you celebrate that. You've organised a march all the way from here at Robe through to Victoria.
It is a celebration to the Chinese, large number of the Chinese landed in Australia, and they made their contribution later on to the Australia, and they are part of the Australia history, particularly that early stage gold rush time.
The Chinese arrivals meant a big change for Robe as a township.
Well, it was quite a moment in history because within a matter of weeks, in fact 1 week, there were 3,000 Chinese landed on the beaches here, which came as a terrible shock to the inhabitants of the town, tucked away as they were at the very end of the British Empire.
So the consequence of this massed arrival was a complete upheaval of architecture in this town.
It really was part of a boom. There was a perfect storm that coincided with a booming wool trade to London and hundreds of thousands of pounds of wool going out of the port. So this little port had ships coming to and fro all at the same time with the wool trade and the Chinese, and the wealth that generated. They say that in the first year, real estate increased by 200%. It's one of the greatest human treks in the world, really, the story of the Chinese coming through Robe, and the extraordinary journey that they made and the impact that had on all the little towns and farms and stations between here and the goldfields and then the goldfields themselves. It was a mass migration which took enormous courage and a great deal of physical stamina to manage.
To mark the Chinese history in Robe, big celebrations have been staged. A ceremonial Pai Fang erected. Jamie Aitken organised all that.
We brought 40 dancers, we brought dragons, we brought fireworks experts, we brought a Chinese opera to Robe, and for 2 days we celebrated this marvellous part of our history. We had 3,500 people minimum in the street of Robe, which were blocked off for 2 days. We had fantastic fireworks. We had dancing here, the special celebrated dragons from Bendigo. We had all of the dancers who'd been trained in China come to enjoy Robe and the beginnings of the journey that took them from here to the goldfields in central Victoria.
For Robe, the mass Chinese arrival started a long history of Chinese residents, with Victor C running a very successful Chinese restaurant these days. One big fan of Victor's and Robe's Chinese heritage in general is local tourism guru Jeff Dent.
And so the Chinese heritage still very much alive here in Robe, as we're seeing here with Victor.
Absolutely. The great thing is, Greg, we've reignited it through the lobster industry, which suddenly revamped itself through the exports to China, and then we had the Great Walk reenactment, and suddenly we've got this influx of people that are coming. More adventurous Chinese tourists are coming here. They're bringing the Winnebagos down, they're driving through the town, they're reconnecting with a place where quite often their great-great-grandparents actually first stepped foot. Robe was turned into a little mini Shanghai, but at the same time, all that new ideas, that new adventurous spirit came through South Australia and went through across to Victoria and expanded the knowledge and made people want to travel and see more of the world.
Marching through Robe, the Chinese gold miners embarked on a trail that would ultimately lead them to gold. In their footsteps, the reenactment march we're following takes the original trail through Robe, past dozens of historic buildings from that era. Then the trail leads them east, through the scrub towards the goldfields. What the reenactment marchers will ultimately be seeking is an apology from the Victorian government for its treatment of Chinese in the 1850s. That will be granted when the marchers finally reach Melbourne and the Victorian Parliament. But in the meantime, the Gold Trail is taking us some 320 kilometres to the township of Ararat.
It was very difficult because Chinese at the time didn't know the roads, they didn't speak English, and also they didn't have people supporting them, and they didn't have food. So they had to carry everything they belong to, and they have to find the food along the way, and many people died. They also try to avoid the police because the police actually try to stop them. Even the local farms will attack them because they're looking different, and they speaking in different language, and obviously they acting different.
Well, after some 2 to 3 weeks of hard, tough walking from Robe, the Chinese gold miners reached this place. They founded a town here, the only town founded and developed by the Chinese because there was alluvial gold here, the township of Ararat.
Marching on through Ararat, the reenactors reached the Gum San Chinese Heritage Centre, which pays tribute to the Chinese role in the town's development. Inside, the marchers discover the elaborate recreations and historic artefacts of the gold rush era. There's even an opportunity to pan for gold. There are real gold specks to be found here.
And Charles, this is what it was all about, gold. This is alluvial gold. So if we sprinkle some of that here, we can see how small those alluvial gold particles are, and yet you collect enough of it. We've got about $100 worth. It was all worthwhile.
Yes, it is. This is a magic metal which has allowed the Chinese into Australia. And so the gold was discovered in Victoria 1852.
Yep.
The woods spread out. So hundreds of thousands of Chinese, they come in here for this beautiful color.
Out of Ararat, the Gold Trail is taking us southeast towards Ballarat. It's a journey of some 100 kilometres, with the reenactors encountering a diverse range of landscapes and creatures. The lure of gold has taken them several months of first sailing, then trekking.
At last, the goldfields, Ballarat, Sovereign Hill to be exact. Eureka!
What our reenactment marchers are exploring today is Sovereign Hill, a depiction of how the goldfields were in the first years after the discovery of gold here. It's a fully operational museum town with actors in period costumes, an operational poppet head and horse-drawn coaches. Ballarat was not just a big gold boom town, but one which experienced sustained high gold yields for many decades. For the Chinese, Ballarat was a key foundation of their community.
So Charles, it's been a long, long trip from Robe, but finally they're here. They're here at Sovereign Hill. What sort of a journey have they had?
Took them weeks or even months, walk all the way from Robe. Finally, they got in here, Ballarat. That's their destination. They were hungry for gold, so finally when they got in here, they were spread out and looking for the fortune they wanted.
There's gold, there's alluvial gold in these creeks, and they're working it hard.
Yes, they come to this region. That's where the Sovereign Hill now, and they found the gold, most of them, and they worked very hard. Initially, they will start working on somebody else's gold mines, leftovers, and then finally, they will have their own miners, and they have their own settlers, and they working on themselves.
So what sort of workers were the Chinese?
Most of them from the farms in the Canton province and the southeast China. So they are very good with the waters, and they understand the soils, and they understand how to use the tools.
Many Chinese got very rich in Ballarat. Their specks of alluvial gold were melted down and in its red-hot form poured into gold bars. This bar, at today's prices, fetches some $160,000. For the Chinese miners, there was a separate settlement set aside for them. Tents were their accommodation. Small timber shops sold their specialised foods and goods, with yet more controversial taxes imposed on them.
In Ararat, this region, not only those miners being charged £10 tax, but also have a £1 residential tax. On top of that, it's quarterly. On top of that, there's additional £1 for protection tax.
The Chinese miners represented some 5% of all miners here. Their presence inflaming tensions, as Sovereign Hill historian Anna Kay explains.
Like other miners who came to Ballarat, the Chinese were hoping to improve their fortunes and their wealth and to seek a better life, particularly for their families. They were known to be sojourners rather than settlers. The intention for most of them was to return back to China. There were Chinese here before the gold rushes. However, they started to arrive in large numbers around 1854, when there was close to 4,500 arrived that year. In the late 1850s, there were around 24,000 Chinese here in Victoria, which represented around 5% of the general population.
From Ballarat, the Gold Trail has led 120 kilometres northeast to Bendigo.
The gold in Bendigo was locked in quartz, requiring a different form of mining. The miners had to dig deep underground, and by the mid-1800s, more than 1 in 5 people here in Bendigo were Chinese, bringing with them their own culture, customs and beliefs to the goldfields.
Reminders of the heady days of gold fever can be seen all around Bendigo. Deep holes remain where Chinese miners lower themselves deep underground. And right across Bendigo, tall poppet heads are visible. Those frames at the top of a mine shaft used to hoist miners down and gold up.
Ballarat was found gold in 1850s, and then Bendigo was 20 years later. But there was a lot more gold being found in the deep underground, and the deepest mine will be 1,400 meters deep, and was the deepest mine in the whole world.
Now, what about the Chinese involvement here in the Bendigo gold mines?
Yeah, that was huge. And the Chinese was involved from lots of Chinese, they moved from Ballarat to Bendigo, and then they involved with the deep mining operation. So it's a very large company operation.
Today, the reenactors have marched through to a museum built to document, preserve and interpret Chinese heritage in Australia. It's been described as the cultural centre of Australia and was opened in 1991 thanks to this man, Russell Jack.
No, it tells everybody about the Chinese, how they came here, how they were treated, and even though they're treated badly, what they've done. I think the contribution in Bendigo is rather special. When you think in 1970 we didn't have a banking account, and all this you see here today, we brought in debt-free. Don't owe a penny on. And once everything's completed, as our contribution to society, we're going to give everything to people. Now, we can't be any more generous than that.
Next day, we board a heritage tram. Its driver, one of the modern Chinese historical campaigners in Bendigo. Dennis O'Hoy not only campaigned to stop the trams being removed from Bendigo, he was also instrumental in preserving one of Bendigo's historic joss houses.
I'm one of the very few volunteers that can honestly say I've driven to Eagle Hawk, Quarry Hill, North Bendigo and Golden Square before the tram service was finished.
So you've had tram drivers, you've had operational workers in the factory?
Yes, well, from my point of view, I was a director of the Bendigo Trust, and I was the one that moved the motion to keep and save the trams in Bendigo. So from the very early stages, I've been involved with the trams, and matter of fact, I was the second person as a volunteer to drive the trams from 73 and I used to train all the drivers.
Dennis's tram terminates at his Joss house, still attended by many Chinese worshippers.
So we're actually standing now in one of the oldest temples in Australia. This was built in 1870.
Second oldest temple in Australia.
Yes, the second oldest. There is one in Melbourne at the Siap Temple, South Melbourne. But certainly of the 8 temples, this is the only one left here in Bendigo.
So historic 1870 built, as you said, and a lot of people still worshipping here.
Certainly, yes. We get a lot of people coming from all parts of Victoria, including interstate, to come and pray and worship here.
So the Joss houses were and still are very important to the Chinese.
Oh, of course, it's a place for worship and to pay respect to your ancestors.
Bendigo also displays new market gardens at Peppermint Green Farm, with vegetables grown on the same grounds that Chinese miners planted and picked their vegetables 160 years ago. This is sited just opposite the Joss house, where a large Chinese camp once stood. From Bendigo, we prepare to visit other places impacted by the Chinese. Places like the paddle wheel capital of Echuca on the Murray River, where Chinese skippers helped transport Chinese miners from South Australia upriver.
It was at the time that Chinese were being brought into Victoria and they were being charged a poll tax. So Cadell decided the best thing was to bring them up on a paddle wheel up from Galwa, up the Murray River. And he could deposit them anywhere along the Murray River, and they got into Victoria without paying a gold tax.
The Gold Trail led to many other parts of Victoria. Now this is the Buckland River near Bright in northern Victoria. There were some 2,000 Chinese gold miners by 1857.
Riots by angry European miners here, the Buckland riots, led to mass evacuations by the Chinese. Graves and memorials here remind us of those dark days, as local historian Diane Talbot explains.
Diane, all quiet and peaceful now, but the Buckland River here at the junction was all heady back in the late 1850s.
Late 1850s, 1857, when the riot occurred on the 4th of July, and after that, yes, it was. Initially, the Europeans had the whole Buckland to themselves. In early 1857, the Chinese started coming up into the valley seeking gold as the Europeans were, but the Europeans resented this because by 1857, the gold was becoming a little bit harder to find. So the Europeans were getting a little bit toey that the Chinese were coming in and getting all these bits of gold off them, and it caused a lot of friction. There were fights, Chinese were getting beaten up, and eventually the whole thing erupted in what we call the Buckland Riot on the 4th of July 1857.
What are you finding, Diane?
What are we finding? We're finding bits of ceramic, pottery, earthenware. Things like this come out of the creek and the rivers quite often in spring after the winter rains have washed a few banks away. This is a little Chinese bowl used for tea or rice. They came in a nest, I think, of maybe 5 or 6 different sizes. They all sat inside each other.
So remnants of a town that was once thriving right here.
That's right.
Gold was flowing so freely in the 1850s that here in Beechworth, this bank was set up to trade gold bullion.
The flow of gold led to gold banks, like here in Beechworth. These days, Beechworth boasts new Chinese gardens in tribute to the town's Chinese history. Catherine Shivers founded this one.
I'm 4th generation Chinese Irish. My great-grandfather was a herbalist in Lexington, and he would have come over from Robe via Ararat to the Ballarat region. My roots here into Beechworth is helped to establish these gardens from back in 1997, so it's been a whirling progress. And as you can see by the gardens, it's just a beautiful tribute to the Chinese.
Chinese gold miners in Beechworth were given a relatively friendlier reception, as local historian Vivian McWaters explains.
Well, Vivian, right here was a village that you've found the remains of, and you've proved the Chinese presence by digging up all these wonderful artefacts.
Yes, that's correct, yes. It was wonderful.
So let's talk that through. What have we got here?
Well, I'm not quite sure what was in that. Probably rice. They were imported from China. And they're quite common. We can still dig them up.
So while you were digging around your house, you found this wonderful item here.
In a broken one of those pots.
So tell us about this one.
This is an opium pot. It's an erotic depiction of a couple making love.
How did you stumble upon all this in the first place?
Bottle hunting was very popular at the time, and my neighbour said, "Oh, you're living right near the Chinese camp." And I thought, "Oh, I'm going to get lots of bottles here." So I started to whack the ground with a mattock because I couldn't find anything. And Tom Melville came along. He said, "Oh, for God's sake, Viv, get yourself a probe," which I did. You just press the probe in the ground, wiggle it if you hit something. If it squeaks, it's glass. If it clunks, it's pottery.
So, Vivian, around here, you've been able to prove that there was a running operational Chinese village.
Oh, definitely.
For the Chinese, displays of their 200 years in Australia are on show at the Chinese Museum in Melbourne. Museum chairman is Mark Wang.
The museum was established in 1983 when the sesquicentenary was coming up, and so it was decided that we're going to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Victoria by having a Chinese museum. My great-grandfather was a road walker. He came in the late 1850s, and that road walk was as a result of at the Melbourne port. At that time, the Victorian government said, "I'm sorry, we don't want to let any more Chinese people off the ships at the port of Melbourne, so we're going to impose a £10 tax." And obviously the ship's captain had to pay the tax, and he couldn't get it from the people who were on board. So he said, "Okay, you're not going to get off the ship. You're going to go around. We're going to drop you off at the next port," which happened to be Robe in South Australia, which was outside the Victorian colony.
Finally, that apology. Our reenactment marchers have trekked all the way from Robe in South Australia. They're going to receive a heartfelt apology from the Premier here at the Victorian Parliament.
Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews met the walkers from Robe to issue an apology, expressing his deepest sorrow to all those who made that terrible pilgrimage on foot.
On behalf of the Victorian Government, on behalf of the Victorian Parliament, I express our deepest sorrow. And I say to you that we are profoundly sorry.
Victorian politician Hong Lim was there for that apology.
I can't remember when I heard the Premier and the Leader of Opposition issue that apology, so I feel very emotional. I mean, everybody in the Queen's Hall at that time almost came to tears, because this is something that we have been waiting for a long time. It is very, very important. We were happy for the occasion. We know that now it turned full circle, that now the wrongdoing has been recognized, that the apology has been given, and we accept that apology accordingly.
What the apology coincides with is 200 years of Chinese in Australia. Chinese milestones celebrated across the state.